Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So welcome back after lunch. I enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoyed the lunch. And I can see you're here for a special treat. We have a very good topic this afternoon. It's called the strategic importance of eScience. And we have three very distinguished speakers, all of whom are involved in research in a broad set of areas, and including funding of the research, which gives them a unique perspective on this overall topic. By strategic, we are thinking about the impact that eScience research and eScience results, maybe more broadly, can have upon society and everything from what happens in the medical fields to what happens in the humanities. And I think actually we're very lucky to have three such people here on the panel. Our approach will be that we will give each of them a few minutes to give some general comments, and then we'll be open for broad questions and answers. And hopefully we'll have 45 minutes to an hour left for that, because really the intent is to have a dialogue together, to raise issues, to ask questions, for those of you who are participating from the audience to make your own points and contributions to this. So that's what we have in mind. We will have a wireless microphone, which Mariah over here will bring around at the right moment. So be sure and arrange for that as well. That allows us also to record. We're recording the session to capture some of the questions for people who watch it in the future. So with that, we have three distinguished members of our panel. Chris Menzel, who works for the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation out of Palo Alto, California. Jason Rohde, who we're very happy to have, has joined us from Washington, D.C., who works for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And then Carlos Enrique de Brito Cruz, who's involved out of Fapesp as the senior director, I believe his title, something like that. But in any case, he has a lot to do with the research that takes place in the state of Sao Paulo. So I think we'll start in this order and let Chris come up first. And if you'll switch the PowerPoint for him, we would love to have that. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Menzel. I'm a program director in the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And the Moore Foundation was started in 2000 by Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, and famous for his Moore's Law about the doubling of transistors density every 18 months. You may have heard of him. You certainly have his processor in your computer right now, almost definitely. He started the foundation with a mission to make a positive difference on the planet, and specifically in environmental conservation and science. And in the science program, we focus on non-biomedical life and physical sciences. So things like microbiology of the oceans up through cosmology, astrophysics. And what we started noticing, hopefully this works, is that no matter what discipline we were funding, we would receive requests for handling data, whether it was extra compute or data management, data analysis tools. And as we saw this pattern emerge over and over again, we decided to start looking at some of the root causes for why this was happening. And so I may have skipped this in the title slide, but what became clear was that the focus for us should be not so much on the technology, but rather on the people who bridge the gap between the technologies that were being demanded and the science questions that were trying to be tackled. And so, so modern scale science data for us is not just big data, volumes of data, but also the highly heterogeneous data and the fast-moving streams of data. And actually there's a fourth dimension that I've been hearing lately about the veracity of the data, how much you can depend on it. And in any case, these people sometimes called pie-shaped, which was coined by a Jim Gray Award winner, Alex Zillay, an astrophysicist out of Johns Hopkins University. But you could also call them e-scientists or data scientists. I think at that point we're just talking about marketing terms. But we're talking about the same thing, and we're talking about not just individuals, but also collaborations between folks that have methodological skill in the statistics and computational sciences, as well as life and physical sciences in our case. Although this really does, as I was talking to Jason over lunch, have a much broader scope if you look at the trend towards all of research, including humanities, social sciences. So I'm just coming at it from the lens of the Moore Foundation. In any case, so the people became very clearly the strategic focus point, and I believe this is something for all of us to consider beyond what new technology is needed to handle data. It's who makes that technology or transfers that technology for use in science questions. So from now on, I'll be referring to them as data scientists, but again, you can call them e-scientists, you can, whatever term you find resonates. The data scientists are interdisciplinary. They work in between disciplines, and there is a definition that I find handy, which is something that was coined by Drew Conway at NYU before he moved on into the private sector. He coined this intersection between statistics, computer science, and a domain or a subject matter expertise. And it's at that nexus that something special seems to be happening that handles and leverages data for new knowledge. And I think this is broadly recognized in science, at least the need is recognized, but the skill set is relatively undervalued. And it's undervalued broadly across almost all scientific disciplines. And here's what I mean. So when you're coming from computer science or statistics, the people who are at this nexus are often seen as doing applied work. And sometimes maybe if you're in an applied statistics department, that's okay. But often if you're in a computer science department, being applied is essentially the kiss of death. You're not going to get a conference paper with your nth iteration application of a novel technique from 10 years ago, even though maybe that novel technique didn't actually work and you made it work. And I think a lot of you, some of you are nodding your heads, but I think a lot of you can appreciate that not fitting the standard model for what it means to be whatever discipline. In the life and physical sciences, folks that are doing this work are often seen as being too computer sciencey or just programmers. And this is unfortunate because these folks, as I mentioned before, are desperately needed. And there's a phenomena that we've noticed over the years of funding these folks, as well as just hearing the constant challenge that they're under, is that when submitting a proposal, and you may recognize this in your own work, to a particular discipline, say oceanography, that the oceanographers will point this way to the computer science departments or to the computer science funders and say, well, that's clearly computer science. And so you will submit your application to computer science, and they'll say, well, that's clearly oceanography. And some of you are nodding your heads, and you notice this. So where does this great idea that everyone likes and you can see the scientific impact for, but it doesn't belong anywhere? So we're trying to handle that. And one of the ways that the Data-Driven Discovery Initiative at the Moore Foundation is tackling this is through really trying to build a home for this kind of research across the campus. So our first foray into this is a large collaboration, partnership really, between 3 universities in the United States, NYU, University of California, Berkeley, and University of Washington, along with a funding partner with the Sloan Foundation, what we're calling data science environments. These are intended to be not just centers, but really places on campus that can support this interdisciplinary work of eScience, data science, what have you. And so there's really, the crux of this talk is about the blueprint for these homes. What do these homes consist of? And I think you'll recognize many of the themes here, but these are not unique themes. Many of you are working on areas that will resonate with this. And it's really the sum total of all of these themes that I think is something for all of us to start paying attention to. So first and foremost, career paths. What does it look like to do eScience in a classic traditional discipline? If it's astrophysics, do you need to have the same career path as your PI, as your mentor, or is there another career path for you? And this is particularly important when we start folding in what industry wants from the workforce, and they're paying quite handsomely for this skill set. So career paths within academia, an ecosystem of software so that we're not just building one-off solutions, but that we're thinking about how this solution fits with other solutions. Education and training that's not just the formal tracks or the professional master's degrees, which are popping up in the United States quite rapidly, but the informal training, things like programs like Software Carpentry, which is a nonprofit that does short boot camp-like trainings for not just new scientists, but also scientists who are trying to fine-tune their skills. Open and reproducible science is another theme that we're focusing on. How can eScience help with a growing crisis in all of science, not just computational science, to be reproducible, reusable, replicable? Collaborations, and this is particularly interesting, the use of physical space for collaborations. So as we move more and more virtually for all of our work, we do still find value in coming together in sessions like this, but even with our collaborators in person, we still tend to be productive in a different way in physical proximity. And each university is looking at how to use that to its advantage across the university. And finally, studying what we're doing. So if we're still emerging and evolving eScience or data science for all disciplines, we need to understand how this movement is going. And so one of the things that the partnership is committed to is studying in real time how this partnership, how this conglomeration of different themes can move data science forward, or data-driven discovery, or eScience. Again, pick your marketing term. So moving forward, some suggestions is, I believe this requires us all, no matter what discipline we're coming from, or whether or not we think we're interdisciplinary, to remain open, particularly to recognize multiple forms of impact, moving beyond just recognizing the scientific article that comes at the end of the research, but unearthing the rest of the iceberg of effort, the code and the data particularly, that goes into creating scientific results, measuring that and recognizing it formally. Obviously, we're very committed to building supportive homes, but many of you are building supportive homes in different ways and learning from each other about what's effective and in which ways is, I think, very important. And then finally, to look for those who don't naturally fit. So again, if you can look for this and recognize when it's not just that the person's not doing quality science, you have to, of course, get over the bar of doing quality work. But once you've passed that bar, to really look for when is something just not fitting in one particular silo, and take a second look, be open to it. There's another way of not naturally fitting, and it's one of diversity. And I want to just mention something that I just saw yesterday at a Wired article. It's an opinion piece by Claudia Perlich. And it's a great piece, I recommend it. I've linked it here. Hopefully the slide deck will be available. But one of the things she said, which was apropos of this talk, was that the problem with data science in academia is that it's not where the magic happens. And I think it's not so important to think about whether or not this is true, but I think what is accurate to say is that this is a belief held by many young researchers coming through, whether you call it e-research or data science or computational science. There is quite a bit of fervor around that skill set in industry. And there is certainly amazing fundamental research to do in industry, but it is not the case that it needs to be unmagical in academic research. And I think many of us are committed to exploring ways that we can support the best people to stay in academic research. And for that, we need to, again, stay open and think about homes for data scientists. The last thing I'll say about this is that this was not just magic as in the problems are magical, but specifically with Dr. Perlich, it was the acceptance of being female in research and the acceptance that, in this case, IBM had of her as a researcher first, and it was quite remarkable. So again, I recommend this as a point of reference. So, obrigado, thank you very much, and look forward to your questions later.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank Brito and the rest in Microsoft Research for the invitation to be here. I'm just thank you, Chris, for that wonderful talk. There's so many things that resonate, I think, with a lot of the stuff that we're doing in the humanities. Again, my name is Jason Rohde. I'm in the Office of Digital Humanities, a senior program officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities. NEH is an independent federal agency in the United States. It was formed in 1965, so we're coming up on our 50th anniversary. Hooray for us. And we fund research in the humanities and social sciences. You might be familiar with, say, the National Science Foundation, and we're sort of like them, but we also fund things like history, literature, and so forth. This is defining the humanities according to the legislation that put us in place. And you can see it's kind of a capacious definition. It's not even really a definition at all if you look at it. It just says what the humanities might include, but is not limited to things like language, both modern and classical, linguistics, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history, criticism, and theory of the arts, some parts of social science, and basically anything that says history of is part of the humanities. So you can imagine that most things do fit in here in some way. Now, when NEH first was created in 1965, we had a funding call in 1966, and among our first call for grants was a call for projects that were, quote, for development of humanistically oriented computer research. And if you look at one of our first grants in 1967, this is a McBee card, by the way. This is how we kept a database, an analog database of our file records for the first 20 years or so of our existence. And this was an NEH grant to support a conference to explore potential application of computer science to the advancement of research in the humanities. Now, this grant was for a whopping sum total of $6,320. That's in 1967. And if I had more time, I'd chart a slightly longer history for you. I feel sort of compelled from NEH to do that. We would have discussed as we're digitizing our old records, we're finding the involvement of IBM in fostering sort of the earliest components of using computation alongside the humanities. It was Thomas Watson Jr., the chairman of IBM at the time in 1965, who was on the commission that helped form the National Endowment for the Humanities. And IBM was central in several conferences and even one of the first publications of what we might consider digital humanities work. So it's much later where ACLS, the American Council for Learned Societies, released in 2006 Our Cultural Commonwealth, which was a report on cyber infrastructure needs in the humanities and social sciences, modeled. Some of you might know that NSF had a similar report a couple of years before that led to their development of the Office of Cyber Infrastructure. And it had a series of recommendations for what, in this time, as with the rise of information technology resources, what humanities and social science researchers would need. And we used this in part to help create the Office of Digital Humanities to foster those programs. So ODH goals developed. You can see here some of the recommendations. Develop and support expertise in digital humanities, which I think you can match a lot of times with eScience. develop new and support existing humanities and social society sciences computing centers, the development of tools for the analysis of digital content, and of course promoting collaboration. And we created a lot of programs that tracked along these needs. I'm only going to talk about one in particular. But so why the humanities and why data? Why and maybe even big data? Roy Rosenzweig, back in 2003, a historian at George Mason University and one of the founders of an early digital humanities center, the Center for History and New Media, wrote, historians, in fact, may be facing a fundamental paradigm shift from a culture of scarcity to a culture of abundance. And you have to understand, in humanities research, oftentimes we're looking for the exceptional, right? The exceptional novel, the exceptional person, the exceptional historical moment. And so we would tease those out of a select group of data. But now we have we move from this culture of scarcity to abundance, and now we have all this data. How does that change how we think about history, literature, and culture? Now, in 2011, in Science Magazine, this nice little statistic where the Google Ngram books, Ngram corpus contains over 500 billion words. The corpus cannot be read by a human, so we're moved beyond that point. The sequence of letters is 1,000 times longer than the human genome. And if you wrote it out in a straight line, it would reach the moon and back 10 times over. So this is more than what a single scholar sitting in a single archive or a collection of archives can actually handle, right? That's just 8 years later. One of the projects that we funded in the program I'll talk about, Digging into Data, was Mining a Year of Speech, and they did a bit of comparison about what is big humanities, because you would typically not think along these lines. Well, on a small scale in big science, you've got the human genome at 3 gigabytes, but the Digital Archive of Southern Speech, 350 gigabytes, okay, there's something, right? Hubble Space Telescope images, about 0.5 terabyte a year. The Year of Speech archive they use is about 1 terabyte, 9 terabytes uncompressed in archival format. But you get up to something like the University of Southern California Shoah Archive, which is a collection of oral histories of Holocaust survivors of 200 terabytes. Or even if you consider, once we digitize all the worldwide analog audio, at least 12, if not to 100 petabytes. So there is big data in the humanities. So what are strategic needs? When we talk about importance, strategic importance, we talk about needs and values. So what are the strategic needs? We've noticed abundance. Our capacity for digitization has exceeded our ability as scholars for analysis. So there's the question of dealing with abundance. There's the question of scale. How do scholars know what questions can even be asked of larger data sets? It's transforming the ways in which we're thinking about scholarship. And then that brings with it a need for skills, need for collaborations across disciplines, because no one scholar can hope to have expertise in all the skills that are necessary to pour through this, to collect the data and so forth in an adequate amount of time. And that brings with it a need for training, not only technical training, which is something that we work on, but also social training. How do we have conversations across collaborative boundaries? So one of the programs that we created was Digging into Data. NEH is the lead agency on this, and the idea between Digging into Data is to address how big data changes the research landscape for the humanities and social sciences. One of our first round was in 2009. We had a second round in 2011, and a third in 2013. It is 10 funding agencies across 4 countries: the U.S., which has us, the NEH, the NSF, and IMLS. Canada, which has a few funding agencies, including SSHRC, SHIRK, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. And we funded about 40 projects that require at least one or more international collaborations. So you have to have a team, a partnership across at least 2 international, or across 1 international border. And it covers a wide array of media: newspapers, sound files, text, images, moving images, all sorts of things. So what are they doing? This is data mining with criminal intent. It analyzes the history of crime using the Old Bailey online archive. That has extensive court records of about 240 years of criminal history in Great Britain. And it has about 197,000 transcribed trial records. And so the team is composed of scholars from George Mason, from the University of Hertfordshire, and the University of Alberta. And they were able to do a couple of interesting things. So they did some analysis where they were looking at co-occurrence. And so they discovered, for example, that there are frequent co-occurrences with the words poison, drank, and coffee, whereas poison ate or eaten were not as frequent, and so what we've learned is that coffee was the poisoner's medium of choice in 18th and 19th century London. So keep that in mind when you go to your coffee break. This image here plots the length across the 200 years of legal history of the archive, and what is trial length in words. And so this scatter plot, what you see, I don't know if I have a little laser, but what you see is you see the scatter plot sort of splits about the first and second quarter of the 19th century. And what that represents, they discovered, is the increased use of the plea bargain, because trial lengths either got longer or shorter, because if someone would plea out, they'd have a very short trial, and as opposed to going on to a much longer trial. So they're getting a sort of sense of intellectual history and of criminal records of the UK. Another project, Mapping the Republic of Letters, is a body of 53,000 18th century letters, and they're analyzing the correspondence networks from various people during the Enlightenment. So people like Voltaire, John Locke, Benjamin Franklin. It's a collaboration of humanities scholars, librarians, computer scientists from Stanford University, University of Oklahoma, and Oxford. And among the surprising findings were that figures like Voltaire and Locke, Voltaire in France, Locke in England, who you see as a humanities scholar, their rare letter that goes out to a foreign dignitary, and you think, oh, this must be how it was. We had an exchange of correspondence across vast spots of land. But in fact, what they're discovering is that they're much more nationalistic in their correspondence than previously expected. So it's changing our view of what the Republic of Letters even looked like. One final example, the impact radiological mummy databases, because everybody loves mummies, right? And this is a collaboration across anthropologists, medical imaging specialists, cardiologists, and so forth. And what they were looking at, they collected in mind whole body CT scans of 137 mummies from Egypt, Peru, Southwest America, and the Aleutian Islands. And the team found signs of the hardening of arteries, heart disease, in 34% of these mummies. And also discovered that it afflicted mummies not just from one particular area, but across all of the different geographical groups that they were looking at. So what that does is actually reveal that heart disease of this type is not a modern affliction because we eat too many cheeseburgers necessarily, but actually has a genetic disorder, and it's actually transforming the ways in which people are going about medical science. It also has the added benefit of increasing knowledge for Egyptologists and anthropologists who are studying ancient cultures. And this is where we get into cross-domain value, this question of need and value. So what are the strategic values of this kind of work? One is impact. How can historical knowledge impact future research and knowledge creation, as with the mummies? This is a scan of one of the mummies in the CT scan. Another is openness, and you see I'm basically reflecting a lot of the things that Chris has said. Data availability, the creation of APIs, and tool reuse and platform development so that people can reuse those tools. The Mapping of the Republic of Letters project went on to win further funding from NEH, and they're developing platforms. One's called Palladio, so that the methods can be used across multiple domains, not just with 18th century letters and correspondence, but any kind of data set that you want to use. You can upload it into sort of a Google spreadsheet, import it into the tool, and start playing with mapping correspondence networks. And we've also been able to use the Digging Into Data Challenge to leverage people who are holding private collections in order to open them up to researchers for further study, which has been a great thing. The third strategic value I want to talk about is productive collaboration. So what does that mean? It means fostering collaboration that respects domain knowledge, domain methods, and individual research questions. One of the things that we've discovered in putting together programs like this is that you can't ever look at collaborators as service providers. You have to look at collaborators as researchers with their own interest and expertise, and be able to come at a problem, maybe with different research questions entirely, but put that together into a collaborative package. One of our other projects, the Poem Viewer, this is a project from the University of Utah and the University of Oxford, and they were looking at a corpus of poetry and sound, the idea of sound. And Catherine Coles here, that you see in the picture, says, we discovered early on that we and the computer scientists have very different approaches to the material. They're much more systematic than we are, and they really want to be able to pin things down. And it's not the instinct of the poet to want to pin things down. We want to open things up. And so there's just a fundamental difference sometimes in how people approach cultural heritage material or material in general. But knowing that, understanding it, creating those communicative, collaborative ties allows you to move on and answer both sets of questions. So this is just a small view of one program that we run to support innovation in humanities research and that has cross ties with eScience. And I'll invite you to learn more about our projects. You can see our URL up there, neh.gov/ODH. And you can also access what is here, the first report. It was a 2-year report in development from the Council of Learning and Information Resources, Library and Information Resources, CLEAR, that they did on the first round of digging into data. They have extensive commentary both on the overall process and also on the individual projects, and I invite you to check those out. We'll also have a second report that's funded by the UK partners on the second round sometime in 2015. But for now, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. I will, my contribution here will be in three parts. First, I will give you an idea of what we do at the São Paulo Research Foundation to reach the point at which you will understand why is that we got involved with eScience and with data and with the subject of this conference, of which the São Paulo Research Foundation is one of the promoters. The São Paulo Research Foundation is a public foundation in the state of São Paulo, Brazil, funded by the taxpayer in the state of São Paulo, and it has the mission to support research in all fields. So it is a research foundation. It's not a science foundation in the Anglo-Saxon term. So we fund research in the arts, in the humanities, in philosophy, in psychology, in biochemistry, in chemical engineering, astrophysics, physics, anything. So we fund research. As I said, the foundation is funded by the taxpayer in the state of São Paulo, which is one of the 26 Brazilian states, but is a especially relevant one because the state of São Paulo responds for about 1/3 of Brazil's GDP. And the way the foundation is funded is that the constitution of the state has an article that establishes that 1% of all state fiscal revenues belong to this foundation. So that gives the foundation a sizable degree of autonomy and stability because, for example, we never have to negotiate with the governor or with the state senate a budget for next year. We get 1%, and actually the constitution mandates that the government is supposed to transfer the money to the foundation every month. It's a legacy of the years in which Brazil had a huge inflation, and getting the money in January was completely different from getting the money in December. All proposals that we receive, and we received 25,000 of those in 2013, all of them are peer-reviewed. Many times we ask the scientists to submit the proposals in English so we can use reviewers anywhere in the world. We have some pride at Fapesp on the fact that between receiving a proposal and sending a letter with a decision to the proposer, it took us last year on average 65 days. It might not be the letter the researcher wanted, but it is a decision about the request. Our expenditures in 2012 were close to $600 million. We used that money to support fellowships for students and postdocs. Every month we pay between 11 and 12,000 people to work in research in the state of São Paulo. Some are undergraduates, some are graduate students, and about close to 2,000 are postdocs. Persons who receive fellowships from Fapesp do not have to be Brazilian. They only have to be working in a research organization in the state of São Paulo. So everybody in the world is entitled to request a fellowship of that type, as long as they are doing research in a university or research institution here in the state of São Paulo. Then we also, fellowships use about 35% of our money. The largest chunk of our money goes into what we call academic research, which is investigator-initiated research in which we do not tell them what they are going to research on. It's their decision. We fund that through 2-year grants, 5-year grants, 11-year grants, and also through a program which is for young investigator. A person who has been a postdoc for 3, 4, 5 years can submit a proposal to us and be funded to start his or her research laboratory in the state of São Paulo with a grant for 4 years. Frequently those are multi-million-dollar grants because the young investigator doesn't have anything when they are starting. So they need to buy all the stuff and fellowships for students and so on. Then we have a program in which we fund research together with companies. Fapesp partners with a company on a matching fund basis, $1 from Fapesp, $1 from the company, to fund research performed at a university, which has results interesting for that company. Some of the companies we associate with are listed there: Microsoft, Agilent, Braskem, Petrobras, Embraer, and so on. We have a list of more than 100 of those partnering companies. That research is funded either to 2-year grants or 5-year grants or 10-year grants for what we call engineering research centers, which are centers which, for example, the one funded by Fapesp and Peugeot Citroën is for working on biofuel-based automobile engines. And we have a program through which we fund research in small businesses. Last year we approved 3 grants every week to a small business in São Paulo to do research in any field. Fapesp has been, other than working with investigator-initiated research, when we want to emphasize a certain topic, we organize a special program which goes in parallel to our open-ended entry for research proposals. And we started doing that with a program that we did back in the 90s, which was a genomics project, which was when we became aware of the need of connection between certain domains of science and computer science, because for that genomics project it was necessary to have an intense contribution from computer scientists to analyze the genome they were working with. Then we started a program back in 1997 on biodiversity, which is our Biota program, which also had several very important interconnections with computer science because, for example, part of the work of this program is to map all the biodiversity in the state of São Paulo. So it means they needed to georeference it, to have the maps, to map the evolution of certain species in their places and so on. That's a program that today involves around 300 PIs, thousands of graduate students. Then we had in 2009 a bioenergy program which deals with bioenergy. Bioenergy is very relevant for Brazil because about 18% of all the energy used in Brazil every year comes from bioenergy, comes from a plant, from sugarcane. So it's very important for Brazil to study and know and understand well about sugarcane. And through this program we ended up with challenges related to the sugarcane genome, which resulted in a research project which is being developed now between researchers here in São Paulo and colleagues at Microsoft Research, because the sugarcane genome has several characteristics that makes it especially wild, especially complicated to determine. Then we have a program which is our Global Climate Change program, started 2010, again with several connections with computer science, with large data sets, with processing of data. One of those challenges is in developing a global climate model, which there are some of those models in the world, maybe 7 or 8, but the one which our scientists the scientists funded by Fapesp are developing is one that includes the global features and at the same time is able to look in detail at features which are relevant for Brazil, which do not appear in other global climate models. Again, a strong connection to computer science and data. And because of all that, and because we have been involved with computer science for some time and with certain aspects of digital scholarships. For example, Fapesp is the organization that brought the internet to Brazil back in 1987, 1988. Fapesp organized in 1997 a digital repository of open access journals. You see, in 1997, open access journals was an expression very seldom spoken in the world. We were doing that back in 1997 through our Cielo repository, which became today one of the most accessed scientific repositories in the world. I mentioned to you the genomics project. I have to mention to you that the Brazilian Society of Computer Science organized, I think it was in 2007, Claudia, some time ago, a workshop, very interesting workshop about challenges for computer scientists, and there they came up with this idea of connecting computer science to other domains. And of course, we as a funding agency, we are very conservative. So whenever a scientist comes to us with a new idea, we say, well, that's difficult, I don't know, we have to look into that and so on. But they kept coming and coming until they convinced us that it was a good idea. And of course, we had a lot of support and stimulus from our colleagues with whom we have been collaborating, especially at Microsoft Research. Tony Hay is a person that helped us a lot in that, Harold, Juliana, Darren, so that we launched this year the Fapesp program on eScience, through which we wanted to foster connection between researchers in computer sciences and colleagues in other domains. We had a first call for proposals. We received 27 proposals. They are being selected as we speak, and we are looking forward to have a number of proposals selected from this call that will start our eScience program. This is the last slide that I want to mention. Is just to list some of the opportunities and challenges that we see in this eScience strand of our activities. Of course, there are enormous opportunities that we can see in new research using data analysis, visualization, data gathering, processing, and several other activities. At the same time, there are challenges because it's, in our view, of course, the first step towards developing an science activity is for you to have collaboration between scientists in a certain domain, scientists in computer science. Now, the thing is that even for collaboration, you cannot have fruitful collaboration between people who do not have some words in common. They cannot be one from one domain, another one from a computer science, and I mean, they leave a yellow note at night to the computer scientist, and the other day the computer science appears with a nice solution to whatever they want. It doesn't work like that. They need to understand each other, and this is one of the important barriers that we feel in our system here in São Paulo and here in Brazil. It might happen elsewhere in the world, but it certainly is present here. The fact that there is on the one hand, a super specialization of the scientists. The scientists tend to become what would be described by a Dirac delta function. You all know what a delta function is, right? When you know everything about nothing. That's a very, very successful scientist. And we would like, I think, for this kind of collaboration to have scientists who look more like a Gaussian function, in which there is a tail that can overlap with the person they are talking to. The problem is that it adds to this difficulty the fact that many times when here in Brazil when people are choosing their undergraduate courses, part of the decision in many cases is made by the following reasoning. Well, I cannot take any more math, so I go into something related to life sciences or the humanities. And then it's difficult for those persons to connect to a computer science at some point. And at the same time, people who go to engineering or physical sciences, they tend to go like, well, I do not want to read all those books and understand all those complicated words. So at 17 years of age, they tend to be split apart. And then when they are at age 30, we want to reconnect them, and it's not so easy, right? So there is a challenge which I think relates to the whole supply chain, I would say, right? With the educational system, with the way education is done for the youth, and we are thinking of ways to work around that so that we can actually foster collaboration between people who talk more or less not the same language, but who have at least some common language among them. And of course that requires us to look for new ways of educating, training for an integrated approach, because it might be good at some point to have some persons who would be able to do both things, to have the two Gaussians in their mind, the Gaussian about the specific domain and the Gaussian about computer science, because then you wouldn't need to have the communication, because communication is a difficulty, right? Unless people have the Vulcan pinch that Mr. Spock uses to read the minds of other people, it's hard. It takes time to communicate, to tell people about what you need and so on. So one of our, I think it was Chris that mentioned about analyzing large data sets. When you are analyzing, most of the time, in my experience, you do not have all the questions beforehand. The questions appear as you are doing that, but you need to be doing that. You cannot be sleeping while the computer guy is going through the lines and the data and so on. So that's a challenge that we see, and we hope to contribute to that through our eScience program. Thank you.
So now, before we take any questions from the audience, I'd like to just ask our three panelists a short question, which hopefully will have a short answer as well. When we talk about strategic importance, one way of thinking about it is what impact for the world would be missing if you didn't do one of the activities you have. I think I'd like to start with Jason in the humanities area. You have a lot of things you talked about. You talked about digging into data and other things. If one of your major focuses was not pursued by some agency or by researchers, what would we be missing as human beings? And then the same question will apply to Chris and Brito as well.
Well, I think I would answer, I mean, we're not curing cancer, right? So, but I think I would answer along the lines of what Brito was just talking about, which is to say that as our information economy continues to change, it's impacting the ways in which all of us are working. We have had this hyper-specialization, and we'll continue to have hyper-specialization. But the ways in which eScience is allowing people to engage in cross-domain and cross-discipline collaboration, I think is going to become very important across just about every single domain. If it's impacting the humanities and the study of history, and anthropology and archaeology, then it's certainly going to impact the economy, and it's going to impact biology and medical sciences. And so I think that would probably be, that's my short answer.
Chris?
Yeah, so not so much with my data-driven discovery official hat on, but I think it's pretty clear that data-driven decision-making is ripe across almost every sector. So we're seeing it in advertising in a big way in places like Bing, but it goes much, much beyond systems like that for deciding how much to sell an ad for a search. And we're starting to see it emerge in things like conservation decision-making, medical decision-making, really anywhere where there's a financial impact for making a decision and with incomplete information. I think this is an area extremely ripe for human impact. Certainly, there's a whole science question, but for societal, I think decision-making is up there.
Rita.
Well, my choice would be a grant, a project that we fund, a center that we fund at Fapesp, which works with public policy and through processing large sets of data about Brazil, about the municipalities, they can learn, they could discover relevant things and recommendations about, for example, the relation between inclusion and exclusion, or poverty and the environment, and how people are distributed in cities, and how that connection relates to the number of years of education of the persons and how they participate in society. And all that becomes relevant information for orienting public policy in several levels in Brazil.
Thank you. Thank you. So with that, we'll open it to discussion with all of you, and please wait for the microphone. Start one back there, and then her.
Sorry.
Okay, we'll start here.
Okay, so is that okay if we switch the order? My question is like a general question to all of you. I'm an astrophysicist, I'm a scientist, and one thing that I usually find while working, like in this eScience and interdisciplinary field, is that it's difficult to find a partner in the computer sciences, especially because what is a breakthrough and new research for us is not necessarily, like new for them. It's usually they already have the solution, but it's not going to turn into a publication for the, like in computer science. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? And Brito, is that eScience proposal is still open?
No, not the one call. We will have other calls.
I'll take a crack. We've been thinking a lot about this, and there's no easy answer to this. Someone mentioned, I think, computer scientists don't want to be tech support for domain scientists. Fair enough. But that said, there are plenty of folks with computer science skills, computer scientists who do want to use their expertise to make a difference, to make an impact, to contribute. And sometimes that is more pragmatic than their careers allow. So if they're going to publish in computer science, I mentioned this already, if they're going to publish in computer science conferences, that conference paper may not count for your astrophysics publication. So it's reciprocal too, right? Like your paper doesn't help them, their paper doesn't help you. So the long answer is we need to really work at this middle and start looking at contributions to science that are not just papers, and that are not just papers in the one discipline. What you can do as a scientist emerging in this space is a little bit more difficult. Finding like-minded folks is your best bet, and asserting over and over again to funders like us that this is important, even if it doesn't lead to traditional measures of impact. But sorry, I don't have the clear answer, but check back in 4 or 5 years and maybe we can, maybe these guys do that.
Right. I'm Gilberto Pastorello. I'm an applied computer scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And I want to ask a question about openness, open data, open access to methods and software. We scientists that are doing eScience work, we can do a grassroots kind of work and work the bottom up, the openness issue. We can work with individual scientists trying to convince them that openness is a good approach for them. But what are the approaches that funding agencies can take to foster that kind of open approach to data. Requiring a data management plan and allowing budgets to do data management work are certainly things that can work in that, but what else can be done in that respect?
We are requiring, even in the humanities now, data management plans. You're seeing a lot more of data management librarians showing up at various universities, and we have them on speed dial for all of our applicants. And allowing for, openness is a balance against sustainability, right? I mean, openness is a great ideal, but it is an ideal, and there's some stark realities about sustainable models out there. And so you get different degrees of openness depending on the levels of sustainability that one's able to support. I think also openness can sometimes be an ideal for certain kinds of institutions that maybe have the resources to account for sustainability, where some other kinds of institutions are not able to do so. I mean, it's a very, as you know, a complicated matter. What we try to do is, one, in our grant applications, we express a preference for openness. We don't require it. In our major grant programs, not only do we require, at least in the Office of Digital Humanities, a data management plan, but we also require a sustainability plan. This allows people to justify their decisions for openness, right? Because if they can present a model in which some of the materials they have to restrict, either for cultural heritage reasons, it could be indigenous knowledge, right, that they don't have a right to make open, or it could be archaeological data that cannot be open because of looting. It also can be data that, we're not out of copyright. I mean, we have a whole 20th century of basically missing scholarship in some kinds of data science because of the proprietary nature of things. So we express a preference for openness, but give an opportunity for the applicant to make the case that's based on what they know and what they think is the best case for their material.
So thank you. Can I comment? Yeah.
Yeah. On our side, we started to tackle this challenge by creating this repository of open access results of science, which is Cielo. Then our second step was to put in place a policy requiring that all researchers funded by Fapesp must make available their publications in an open access repository at their institutions. This policy is in place. However, we are not enforcing it tightly so far because many institutions are still developing their own institutional repositories. And now we are in the process of discussing data management requirements for certain proposals. In our eScience program, the call required the proposers to submit their data management procedures for the results. But we are, with what we are going to learn from analyzing those proposals, we will perfect it to use in all of our programs. But we certainly consider this to be a very important route towards developing science in the state of São Paulo.
So I just want to pile on. I think the requirements are absolutely necessary, both, and you often hear about the two levers, the two incentive levers of science, the publishers and the funders. And having both of them on and requiring data sharing plans is clearly part of the answer. But again, I keep digging at this problem because it's a necessary but not sufficient step. Because when you start thinking about what constitutes a funder, generally speaking, particularly public funders of science, of research, what drives funders and publishers are peer review, almost universally. So peer review then are making decisions about what to fund and what not to fund, how good the data management plan is, if they're even looking at it. And so I keep coming back to the peers are essential. That's the sufficient step. You need the requirements, but you need the peers to see or to agree universally that openness is a signal of impact. And what we're beginning to see is a recognition that just staying on publications for a second, not so much data yet, but we'll get there, is that open access articles are, have higher impact, right? They're cited more. There's some study, I wish I could quote it off the top of my head right now, but that's an interesting finding, and we're going to see more of that, I predict, over the future, and we'll see that for code, and we'll see that for data, and ultimately impact is what matters to everyone in this room. And so that's the thing that's going to tip it over the edge, I predict. But we can't do it without the requirement, but you need also the peer review community, the PIs, to agree that's important.
Thank you. So we have two questions over here, Dan and then Kathleen.
So I think you've actually, sorry, I'm Dan Kent, University of Chicago. I think you've almost answered the question I was going to ask, but I'll try to ask it slightly differently anyhow. So I think if I summarize what I've heard, it's that there are things that the funding agencies want people to do differently. Collaborate across disciplines, collaborate between computer science and other disciplines, other things like that. And the mechanisms for encouraging that primarily has been funding, and then secondarily has been mandates, data management plans, data sharing, things like that. And then the third piece, which there hasn't been much discussion of until, again, Chris's comment just at the end, has been the community incentives that make people want to behave in this way without the funding agencies requiring them. And so I guess I'm curious from the point of view of the three of you as to what you think the agencies can do to change the culture so that people will behave in this way without you having to give them money or say that you must do this.
Must be a good question.
I'll go. I think that there's absolutely a role for funders in this conversation, but we can't be the only voice, which was why, frankly, I was happy that this was organized as a panel discussion and not just a bunch of funders talking to folks about the wisdom, the magical wisdom that funders have. I can say from my perspective, and I imagine it's similar for my panel, my co-panelists here, that it's not so much that we want things to be collaborative, but what we're seeing is a demand for collaboration. And so, for instance, in my program, we're very much responding to the demand from the community that we were serving, that the thing that was missing were the people that were working interdisciplinary, that were bridging the gap. And so, in addition to mandating and incentivizing with money, I think also convening folks and coming to convenings like this with folks that generally are part of this early wave, this early movement to have eScience or data science or data-driven research be kind of firmly established in the academy writ large. That's the instigating role that we can play. I'm happy to be on the stage, but many of you have greater wisdom in many areas, and so being in a dialogue together and finding ways together is something that often funders have a little bit more breathing space to do. So.
I would say that we at NEH are field driven, and so most of the work that we do, it's rare for us to have thematic calls like digging into data. Most of our calls are fairly open. But most of the decisions that we make, and even the formation of the Office of Digital Humanities and the creation of something like digging into data, were based on field-driven articles, discussions, convenings, and so forth. Greg Crane, who's a classicist, well known for the Perseus Project, the phrase, "What do we do with 1,000,000 books?" which was an article he wrote for DLib, was in fact one of the key articles that led to the formation of digging into data. And so I think Chris was hitting the nail on the head in the end of his comments for the last question, which is that peer review and peer motivation, field-driven work is what really leads us in the directions. And then what we try to do is create opportunity to fulfill what it is that the field wants.
Yeah, I would follow on that, perhaps by stating that, well, at least for us here in São Paulo, the agency is it's connected to the community. It's not that the agency is in a castle and it creates inventions, even though most of the researchers sometimes think it is like that. But the thing is that of all the programs that I have described there, we only started thinking about them because some relevant part of the science community brought those ideas to us. So that applies also in what pertains to the values. However, I think I understand your question in the sense that it is much more difficult to change the values of a community than to offer them money to do this or that research and to have this or that criteria. And that is something that we see when we have a program like, for example, the eScience program. We send the proposals out to reviewers. In many cases, the reviewers will come out with comments like, well, why is that you need to have a computer scientist with someone else? Why is that it would be better for them to hire a company to develop whatever? Because the reviewer didn't understand what was the basis of the thing. But you have to keep working with the community until those values are heavier in their thinking.
So I am Kathy McEwen from Columbia University, and I'm a computer scientist. And so I'm somewhat dismayed by the sort of negative comments about the willingness of computer scientists to do interdisciplinary work. I served as department chair at Columbia starting in 1997, and at that time was doing interdisciplinary work with the medical school, and I certainly saw a lot of interdisciplinary work going on within the department, including quite a few tenure cases that went through during that period of time. So I think computer scientists, my view is that a good number of them are interested in doing interdisciplinary work. And so the question would really be for people who are looking for computer scientists, how to make that happen in an easier way. On the one hand, I would say that just about every field is looking for computer scientists. So when we look at, sort of bringing people together, it can often be that the computer scientists are overstressed in terms of the number of other people who are asking for collaboration. I guess one thing I would recommend is sort of in order to avoid the pitfall, which Chris has mentioned, which is that computer scientists don't want to be seen as technicians, doing other people's, uninteresting sort of work, is to leave open the scope of possibility. So for example, if you throw a data and a sort of issue that you're working over the side of the fence and then begin conversations, I think that often things are opened up that perhaps that are directions for the computer scientist that the person in the domain might never have thought about. And of course it goes the other way too, where the person in the domain can sort of open up problems that the computer scientists had never thought about. One last thing I would add is publications. So I think this was briefly mentioned, but certainly having venues for publications that are far more open to new and different kinds of work would be helpful.
Thank you. More questions? There's one right there. Actually, Dan, you'll pass it.
I am André from Unicamp, and my question about the thing, I see that you are investing a lot in the idea of eScience, but still it seems to me that eScience is something of computer science and science. And in my view, is much more than that. I think that probably the eScience will be the future perspective of science, in the sense that you take the science as an object of study and try to improve it, the view and so on and so forth. And I want to ask to the board what you see as the future perspectives of investment and looking on in science. It's how you see that this will improve or grow in the future.
Can I go first here? That is interesting, because the way, when I finished my slides there, I had one line, I think the last line, which was like training people to understand each other's demands and domains and so on. But actually, the next thing that I had in mind, but I was not bold enough to write there, is that in some cases we would like to have, at some point in the future, those two persons in one person. That is, a person that would be able to think about science using themselves the instruments of computer science, because then you would be more into the realm of doing a different type of science and not only adding two things. But I think there is a long way to there, and I do not think it would be something that you should try to convert into a pattern to be followed. That will happen in some cases. You will have some persons who will be able to do that, or who will be willing to risk that and will feel happy about doing that. In many other cases, I would say, you will be talking about the pair, the collaboration, the domain scientist and the computer science, and then, of course, we are supposed to spend time and effort in lowering the barriers for this connection.
I think along those lines, we're seeing increasingly, there's a lot of humanities scholars who want to do some kind of work with computation, but they don't need the skills that a full-blown computer scientist would need. You know, they need to be able to write scripts to clean up, to do data curation. They need to be able to write basic algorithms in order to do some simple searches. They need to program in R so they can do statistical analysis, right? And these are not things that they need a computer science degree to do. And so what we are seeing are transformations in education, not necessarily specifically in graduate programs, although sometimes. But I'm thinking of, at the University of Virginia, for example, there's a lab called Scholars Lab, and they're drawing humanities scholars, PhD students from across their disciplines, and they run a 6-month to a year-long program and on top of their regular study, in which they do training in basic scripting and data curation and project management in R or something like that. And they all build a lot of times a project together that would be considered a digital humanities project, right? Using some components of eScience or data science or computer science, but not requiring, again, the full component, the full toolkit that computer science has. And I think that's an opportunity for us to explore new educational models where we're training people to know enough, right? I mean, knowing a little bit is a dangerous thing, of course. But it has a twofold effect. One, it allows them to do some of the basic work that is maybe some of the work in the past you would see a scholar maybe try to hand over to a computer science colleague that they may not be interested in. But it also opens up these opportunities for conversation and communication when they are at a point of collaboration, right? They know enough to be able to have that conversation so that when they're really up to speed, when they really need to move forward with a project in which a collaboration would be a fruitful thing, both the computer scientist and the humanities scholar have the vocabulary to make that collaboration possible.
I think all that was just said is spot on. The only thing I'd add, just because we do, at least the Moore Foundation, think about this as data-driven research, data-driven discovery, is I just include in the conversation statistics, often overlooked, some nodding heads. It's a foundational, it's part of the three-legged stool that we subscribe to, and I think it's just important that, you know, the answers were spot on, and I would just kind of sticky note statistics onto that. So.
Question here.
Hi, my name is Anderson. I'm from USP. My question is for Carlos. You mentioned a lot about genomics and the partnerships you've got between Fapesp and the companies. But my question is, have you got any actually partnership between Fapesp and any other company that works with metabolomics?
Not at this point, no. The collaborations we have with companies refer to other topics known in metabolomics specifically. No.
Thank you. This is really interesting. And I was kind of thinking about your ethnography issue. When you mentioned that it's one of the dimensions that you were trying to foster in understanding, did I get it right, and understanding how data-driven science and these collaborations go about, or did I get it go? I mean, this is not the end of my question. This is the beginning of my question, but at least that's what I understood. And based on my understanding of what you said, okay, I was thinking of what the panel mentioned about education, training, and ending up with Brito's mentioning that maybe, ideally, a person should tend to self-sufficiency up to a certain point to be able to think with two heads or three heads or four heads, and complementing what Jason said about training people to use tools. Now, what about diversity? And when I mean diversity, I do not mean gender or culture or race. What I mean is about diversity in conducting science, and so that different kinds of people with different profiles and different views would develop maybe better science. And in this sense, the self-sufficiency or the use of tools would not be enough. So, did you want to,
I'll attempt, yeah. And partly it's how to get a simple answer to a fairly complex question. But maybe here's a way to think about it, at least one of the ways that we're thinking about it. And the reason why I think ethnography is important. So it turns out if you talk to enough people, this phenomena that we're describing sounds very familiar to a lot of us. This is not the first time that we've dealt with different academic cultures coming together. Computational science comes to mind as when that emerged as an area where two very different cultures needed to come together. Bioinformatics emerged and really kind of developed its own culture. But what we keep saying over and over again is culture, and academic culture, and communication. And we're, most of us, a bunch of scientists, not me particularly, but most of you all are scientists, and yet we don't often apply science to how we work. And so there is a science of science, and but the practice of ethnography allows us to observe and record and try to understand how it is we work, live, produce. And I think it was really the discipline of applying, I mean, this first emerged as we were designing this partnership as the data science of data science. You know, let's not go forth and not collect data, analyze it, and use it for improving ourselves. Let's not say that everyone else should do data science, but we shouldn't use it on ourselves. And so it really is a recognition that that there's, and I think Paul mentioned this, that there's a certain amount of social engineering going on that we're all involved in, all of us really, and that if we want something to change, it's not good enough to just put a carrot or a stick out, but that you really should understand how people work. I don't know if that's sort of, okay.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to ask one final question, and then Claudia has an announcement if you want to give the microphone to her. My final question is, do you have a dream of an area in this whole field we've been talking about that you could see in the next 10 years could make a huge difference? I asked you the question the other way before. If we didn't do something, what would we lose? I'm now asking you the question in terms of talking about the strategic importance of eScience. Is there one thing, and it's okay if you all come up with the same thing, that would be interesting. Is there one thing that comes to your mind that really would be fantastic? And I don't know who goes first. It's a difficult
I have a really
question.
quick answer.
Oh, go ahead.
Support misfits.
Repeat that?
So misfits, people who don't fit. Find those people who keep getting told to go over there for funding and yet have the most brilliant idea. Start working with them, finding them, but also supporting them. I think if I had a dream, it would be in 5 years that there were a lot of misfits being funded.
Good.
And in line with that, that's the people side, and in the subject's domain side, I think domain overlap, supporting domain overlap is a very complicated thing. But we funded a project called Merkutu, which is a content management system that respects indigenous cultures, cultural protocols about individual objects. So certain people within indigenous cultures have a right to see certain kinds of objects or do not have a right, or maybe that culture does, but the rest of the people don't. But they still need archival practices. And this same project is going around and working with indigenous tribes and talking not about sort of just cultural practice, but how it impacts things like waterways and the science of water in their communities, right? So you have these multiple overlays of both cultural practice, pure science of like just water and cleanliness and health and all these sorts of layers. And I think supporting that kind of cross-domain research is an area that it would be nice to be able to foster even more.
Well, my shot here would be to see researchers interacting much more intensely across domains, not only computer scientists and scientists from other domains, but across all domains, physics with life sciences and so on, because of course data is an important part of that, but it seems to me that most of the big challenges in energy, health, public policies, environment today are challenges which cannot be tackled by one discipline. They need many disciplines, and whatever we can do to lower the barriers for the interaction of scientists across domains will help. So my dream would be to have them interacting much more intensely in the future.
Thank you. So this is just the beginning. Tomorrow morning we have a panel session on the subject of going native, which actually is a very good continuation and was partly covered today. So we will continue the discussion with a different group tomorrow. And with that, I would like to thank our panelists for spending time with us and sharing their experiences and knowledge. Okay, Claudia.